Okay, so we're entering into a stage where we could have this chastisement, right? We don't know. I mean, it could drag out, or God could do something differently, but it looks like it's coming down the pike, at least from what Our Lady's talking about and the way she's talking, and it's leading up. So then people ask me, okay, well, if there's going to be this chastisement, what about prepping? You know, should I have a bunch of food? No, you should give it to me. No, okay. The point, so it basically boils down to this. If you remember in Scripture, Christ does the parable about the guy who builds the towers because he's going to have this thing, and Christ makes the observation of how foolish he was because that night he was going to basically die, right? The point being is what? It has to do with you have to be spiritually prepared. You can prep until the cows come home, but I am going to talk a little bit about it. But you can prep until the cows come home, but if you're not spiritually prepared for what's coming down the pike, you're going to be a mess. Doesn't matter how much prepping you do. You're not going to be able to psychologically handle it. Natural prudence, putting aside supernatural prudence, natural prudence dictates that if we look at our food supply in this country, it's very tenuous. In the average grocery store, there's somewhere between 2 to 3 days supply up to 3 weeks. That's it. That's it. And part of that is because instead of having developed a more agrarian society where people were actually producing the food more locally, we relied on shipping and trucking so that we get our food from all over the place. The problem is not much is being grown locally in most areas. Not all areas, but in most areas. I always feel sorry for the guy. If the chastisement coming, the ranchers are going to have a problem because everyone's going to be trying out there poaching their cattle. But the point being is that the food is tenuous. So natural prudence. We also see this with things like Katrina and other natural disasters. People will go a week to 2 weeks without it. And then, of course, when the natural disaster starts coming, of course, the grocery stores just get pillaged in a 24-hour period, right? So natural prudence would dictate that you should have at least some food supply. Even our federal government, who I'm not particularly fond of, itself has said, you should have a certain amount of food on hand. Even though they may, I think if I'm not mistaken, if you have more than 6 weeks, it's illegal by federal law. I think. That's something to research. But here's the thing, I tell people, I say, what do you think of that law? It's an unjust law. They can't tell you that. Right? It's like them telling you that you can't, it's the same problem with telling people that they can't develop the virtue of sobriety in their children by allowing them to drink something at home before the age of 18. Excuse me, but the parents have the natural rights to develop a proper virtue of sobriety in the child. Right? So you can't say that, because what does the government do? Well, when he's 18, he's on his own, he doesn't have to listen to you, but by that time, no, but you can't let him drink until he's 18. Oh, yeah. Okay. So anyway, that being said. So you should have some basic food storage and some kind of water supply. Basic. Now, don't think that in having this, you're safe. In fact, my joke is, if you got food supply, you better also have an ammo supply. Because people are not virtuous. But death can come like a thief in the night. As I said, don't think this is going to save you or even make your life easier. Father should just do it as a basic supplying for the sake of the children and his wife. But you have to remember, to whom the effects of the chastisement extends is entirely the choice of God. Now, you can pray that you're spared the effects of it, and that's a good thing, to pray you're spared the effects of it, and your children and your relatives, etc., are spared the effects of it. But it's really up to God to determine it. That's why Our Lady said in the quote I read last night that it will affect even priests and even the good priests and faithful. It's going to get all of us. I mean, obviously, if you're going across a train track and
You weren't paying attention, and all of a sudden you just get across the train track and the train goes ripping by. That's probably a signal, grace, that you need to get your act together and focus a little more and work on the virtue of circumspection, which is paying attention to your surroundings, right? That's a signal, grace, all right. But then on the other hand, if you come up and the train goes by and now you're stuck for 15 minutes while this thing goes by, well, that's a signal, grace, that he wants you to work on patience, right? So on those particular things, you should be paying attention to the signal graces, but when it comes to the signal graces, when it comes to our imperfections, we have to understand that most people, even though they're given graces, so as they start ascending the heights of prayer, God gives people more and more graces, and as they start to become more perfect, they get more and more graces. One of the things that happens in that process is that the person becomes blinder and blinder to themselves, and that their salvation, they recognize on their part, if it's left to them, they will be damned. Whereas they know that if it's up to God, then they can be saved. And so one of the things that they will begin to do is they stop looking to that type of thing and they start focusing on what God is calling them to do by these other graces. Work on this defect, work on that particular aspect of your spiritual life. One of the things that most people don't realize is that the moral virtues, it's not, once you've achieved them, you're done. Right? It's not the type of thing that once I reach temperance, then I never have to worry about temperance again. That's not how it works. The time that I would see it the most when I was a priest in the parish, when I was the pastor, one of the things that guys would come into confession and said, Father, I mastered chastity when I was in my 20s. I did a really good job. I mastered chastity. I've been living chaste. I'm now 45. I've never fallen since then. And I've been living chaste in relationship to my wife. And now all of a sudden I'm having all these impure thoughts and I'm getting tempted in these other directions. Now there's two reasons for that, I tell them. The first, and this is a part of that signal graces, this is an indicator that God's working with this person. It's just that a lot of times when people receive graces, most people, because they don't know God, and because they don't know the structure of the spiritual life, and because they don't know how grace works, and because they don't know how virtue works, they think something's wrong. And I tell them, no, nothing's wrong here. So I tell them, did you fall? No, I didn't fall, but I've been tempted. Okay, that's a sign of one of two things. It's either a sign that in the moral life, as St. Thomas says, when it comes to the moral virtues, you have to continue practicing the moral virtues, because if you don't, they begin to decline. So you have to, that's why you have to, fasting is not, okay, I fasted, now am I done? No. We get this all the time with people, they want to do that on their spiritual life, they want to check the boxes, and especially if they want to have prayers said by me because I'm an exorcist. Okay, Father, I did that. That's not how this works. The reason we're having you pray on a consistent basis is to build the virtue necessary, because when you go through solemn session, and because you're possessed and you go through solemn session, the sessions are so brutal on people that if you don't have a certain level of virtue and fortitude and stick-to-itiveness and have built the virtue of constancy, you're just going to bail, which is about 60% of them. This is why we haven't built it beforehand. But it's an indicator that God is, I tell them, no, it just means that God wants you, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong, it doesn't mean you've lost your virtue, it just means you've got to maintain it and keep working on it. And I tell them, don't worry about it, just keep working on it, it'll start to wane as time goes on, it usually does within a little bit of time. But there's another reason, and it has to do with this. Virtue is one of those things that can always be increased in the soul. You can always have more virtue of any of the virtues. There's not a limit of how much virtue you have.
If you're functioning normally, that's probably a sign your guardian angel's pretty active in the background, helping you out and keeping you protected. If you're not, it's a sign he's probably not, because demons do the opposite. Their goal is to afflict you and make your life miserable and get you to the point where you lose self-control, you lose your rationality, etc. That's their goal. So it's the opposite. And because of our nature, things that are in accord with our nature just seem natural to us, so we notice them less. The opposite is the case, that when demons act upon us, we're much more sensitive to it when we feel miserable or things like that happen. So that's one of the things. So what does this tell you? It tells you that the guardian angels are probably far more active in your life than you even realize. And that actually brings up a real interesting observation. How many people actually pray to their guardian angel every day here? Okay. How many of you develop a constant communication with him? Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay. Did you ever hear the story about Padre Pio and his guardian angel when he was 10 years old? Some of you might have heard of it. Okay, this is what happened. A boy in the village where Padre Pio was living got lost, right? And Padre Pio was playing, and they said, well, why don't you come help us try and find this? And he says, well, why don't you just ask your guardian angel? And they looked at him funny, so he just turned to his guardian angel and says, where is he at? His guardian angel tells him, and he says, well, they're over there. He's over here. So they go there, they find the kid. That was the first time, 10 years old, it was the first time that Padre Pio didn't know that everyone else didn't see their guardian angel. He saw his guardian angel the whole time. He used to even chastise him when he would get beat up by Satan. He was like, where were you? Right? So, but again, that comes back to God determines it, right? Even our guardian angels can't do things unless God allows it. But there's one other time in which they are allowed. How much involvement your guardian angel has in your life, aside from what God allows, is directly proportionate, other than, again, what God allows, to how involved you get him in your life. If your complaint is that your guardian angel isn't helping you very much, just go stand in the mirror to look for the cause. Because the fact is that if you were praying to him more, he would be able to communicate with you more. You would be empowering him more by asking him to help you, asking him to give you this enlightening, this understanding. You'd empower him to actually help you more. If you never pay any attention to him, he's just not going to be able to help you very much, because your relationship with him is largely on your side. He's willing to be completely involved in your life, but how much he's involved in your life is really up to you. Unfortunately, most people don't hardly pay any attention to their guardian angel.
So I first wanted to lay out that Our Lady went through this tremendous suffering, right? And that she was willing to sacrifice. And even in Calvary, she didn't count the personal cost. That was not her focus. Her focus was entirely on God during that process. So this demon says at the fifth sorrow, I commanded him to tell me what was going through her when she was at the foot of the cross. And he basically revealed that God had given her a grace to recognize that this was a sacrifice that only she could offer. It was something that he was asking of her particularly. And this is true. She's the only one that can submit to her son being put to death brutally. And she not only suffered the pain of seeing her own son put to death, but she knew him like no other individual. She knew he was absolutely innocent. And yet she had to watch an innocent person being brutally put to death. And yet she was willing to do that. Then I commanded him to tell me what was going through her in the sixth sorrow. And he said, consummatum est. Now this is a woman that's possessed, she doesn't know Latin, she doesn't know hardly any theology. In fact, the demon's nickname for her is the stupid woman. What's interesting though is they get their comeuppance even when they do that. So one time they were haranguing her, telling her how dumb she was and how dumb she was, and she admits she's not that bright, right? Which tells you something about her humility. But at a certain point when they were haranguing her, she finally just turned to the demons and said, I might be stupid, but at least I'm not foolish. Shut them up. All right. Now this consummatum est, as I mentioned, in a sacrifice, Christ's sacrifice begins at the Garden of Olives. When he says to God the Father, he makes the offertory, not my will, but thine be done. That's the offertory. Then the slaying of the victim is the brutal passion that he goes through. And that passion
We see in this in the book of Isaiah, but we also see it in St. Paul. But there's a mentioning of the fact that all of the sufferings, that each individual suffering that Christ went through was to be able to merit our healing and to merit the overcoming of the punishments due to the fall of Adam and Eve and for our sin. And then he himself said, when he's on the cross, at a certain point when he's on the cross, they hand him, or they put up to him the sponge that has this the gall in it, which would cut the pain that he's suffering in, but he turns away from it. And the reason he turns away from it is because he's turning away from the delight of the fruit of the tree. He's undoing that particular aspect of the fall of Adam, who ate the fruit. And so after that, he says, consummatum est, which means everything, all of the merit that was necessary to merit the totality of our healing was finally complete. And then he gives up his life, right? But Our Lady, her consummatum est is when she, at the sixth sorrow, when they take Christ down from the cross and she embraces him, which is an indicator that she fully accepts, it's complete now. Her sacrifice is complete by embracing her son's death in a complete fashion. So then she goes to bury Christ, and in the seventh sorrow, and I commanded the demon what was going through her in that, and he said, finitum est. Now that distinction between consummatum est and finitum est is a distinction that liturgists used to make in the 1900s. It's one of those distinctions that, unless you're someone like me who has trifocals from reading excessively, you're unlikely to know this distinction. In fact, there's hardly anybody on the planet that knew it, but the demons knew it. We actually see that in the old Rite of Mass, that distinction. The priest consumes communion, that's the consummatum est. That's the completion of the ritualistic sacrifice in the Mass. But the ritual isn't finished yet. And so when you get to the part of the Mass before the Placet Sancta Trinitas, which is one of the last prayers the priest said before he blesses people, before that he turns to the people and he says, Ite missa est. Now, the phrase ite missa est does not mean the Mass is ended. That was just a bad translation. It actually means it is sent. And it refers to the fact that after the priest receives Holy Communion and everything is finished, and he says the post-communion, that the sacrifice of the Mass has been sent to God, and it's therefore finished. That's the finitum est of the actual Mass, but it means it's been sent. And it's after that, for the first time, that the word obfere, which means to offer in the Mass, is in the past tense. It's been sent. It's been offered, okay? It's at this point that Our Lady at the tomb realizes that everything, all of the suffering and pain that God had asked of her is now finally finished. All the things she knew that was going to happen to her son, all these things, this pain she carried for her entire life was now finally finished. And yet we refer to all her sorrows as sorrows. In all of the corpus of the Church's prayers, there's only one prayer that I'm aware of where they refer to Our Lady's sorrows as vulnera, wounds. But if you read the context of the prayer, they're not talking about Our Lady being wounded. Our Lady was never wounded. It's not like after the Passion, she has to sit down with a therapist and go through a few things. She didn't do that. Why? For the longest time, I was wondering to myself, why is it that Our Lady wasn't wounded through all of that? And so what I began to do is I had written a couple of books, and in those books I was actually unpacking what the nature of a wound is. So a wound is when some external agency acts upon us and or on something, and it causes damage, right? And then in that damage is also pain. And that pain requires a certain healing process in order to undo. So that's kind of the general structure of a wound. And so Our Lady, for the longest time, why wasn't she wounded in this? We also see this just in her general psychology, right? So then one day I'm reading St. Thomas Aquinas on wounds, and he says, a thing can only be wounded when there's resistance to the thing causing the damage. Now, this is actually true. So if you take a knife, right, and you press it on your hand, but you don't create any resistance on your hand, it stings a little bit, but it doesn't penetrate. It's only when I create the resistance can the knife then penetrate, right? And so what this tells us is that in physical wounds are very much like psychological wounds and also spiritual wounds, that we only become wounded because there's resistance to the pain, there's resistance to the suffering. Our Lady never resisted the suffering. She fully embraced every single sacrifice, every single painful thing, and never once counted the personal cost. And that's another way of saying there was never any resistance to anything God ever asked of her. If you notice, what's happening is anytime she's asked, her immediate answer is yes to God. One point, there was this one demon was talking about how beautiful she was. And so I said to him, so basically when God saw how beautiful was, he gave himself to her, and he says, no, you have the order wrong. So whenever they flatly correct you, that's usually an indicator they're telling you something that's true. And so I said, then what was the right order? He said, when she saw how good he was, she couldn't help but give herself entirely to him. And the way the indicator for that is Our Lady did have a mystical life leading up to the time of the Annunciation. She did actually have, a mystical experiences from time to time during that phase. In fact, they say that Our Lady was confirmed in grace. She was at the eighth level of prayer prior to the Annunciation. And that confirmed in grace, or that preservation in grace, was in point in fact that God kept her from falling into sin. And then once she accepted the fiat, that is, she accepted what God was asking and gave the fiat, then at that moment she entered into a confirmation in grace, which means she couldn't sin from that point on. But it's at that moment that she gives herself entirely to them. This is when the mystical marriage between our Lord and Our Lady is perfect and complete, because she now becomes a spouse of the Holy Spirit. Okay. So that meant that when she saw how good he was, we see this with ourselves. One of the worst experiences that you can have as a priest is going to a convent where the nun that runs it, the mother that runs it, is so holy and so good, and she starts asking you of stuff and you just can't tell her no, right? So it's just, she's actually just like, if I tell her no, this is terrible, right? Well, it's the same thing in relationship to Our Lady, that she realized, there's no way I can tell him no, and she just gives him everything. She also sees in how good he is that she is nothing in comparison to him, and so why would she count the personal cost? Okay. So then she never once, in counting the personal cost, she never resisted, and this is why she was never wounded. She suffered tremendously. In fact, Our Lady's suffering is far beyond anything we're even capable of comprehending.
But the virtues that we take in this life is what people are going to see in your soul for the rest of eternity. That's what you're taking. And so by him giving his life, people will look in him and see the soul of piety in relationship to it. And it'll be magnificent. What about some falsifications of the example of sacrifice? Well, if you see in marriage, people want to determine when they can render the marital debt or not wanting to suffer the defects of the spouse. Look at the fact of the matter is that the reason your spouse has defects is because God's going to use them to chisel away at your own lack of perfection and for you to grow in virtue. In fact, God is a master at it. He seems to hook people up who seem to have just the right conflicts. right? Another falsification in marriage would be not choosing charity or mildness, which is the greater good, but arguing or punishing the other out of a desire for vindication. One of the things I've noticed just in observing marriage is that, you know, and having written 3 books in psychology, this is one of the things, you just start watching people and seeing what their behavior is. And one of the things I've noticed is the patterns in people who are married is the fact that marriages break up because there becomes some point in the marriage where the spouse refuses to give up that lesser good in order to save the marriage, which is the greater good. I'm not putting up with this anymore. Then, not wanting to accept their respective roles which God established. You know, I think we forget, Genesis was not just an observation on the side of God's part, it was a command. You will work in thorns and pain. You will bear children and raise them in suffering. That these were actual roles that God built into the very structure of the natural law in men and women. And so the falsification is when we don't want to accept the roles. Where do we see this? You see, one of the biggest ways you see men failing to sacrifice within their marriage is when they capitulate their headship, or when they fail to love their wives and put her good before his own. Giving into his wife. God himself says it in Genesis, because you listen to your wife, now this is what's going to happen. I wonder if the words were, now you listen to her, now you're really going to listen to her. All right. With women, what happens? If you actually look at the structure in Eve's fall, where she refused to offer up this, to step away and say, no, I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to eat the fruit, and offer that up to God and be willing to suffer the loss of what she was being proposed to her by Satan, which of course was deceptive anyway. But if she would have said, no, I'm not going to do that, then if you look at it instead, what he tempted her with was 2 essential things. The first is, by doing this, you will attain the knowledge of the gods. So St. Thomas says that the temptation is that by committing this sin, by our own work, we will obtain our perfect beatitude, which is impossible. So that's the first thing, is that you'll obtain this. And then the second thing is, he tempted her with self-sufficiency. He tempted her independent of Adam, and so she makes the choice for herself to pursue these things on her own. What does that sound like? A career. Women in the pursuit of the career over the good of raising children is a failure in sacrifice. The career is a lesser good than the children. Some of you might have heard me say this. I quote G.K. Chesterton. He says, I don't know why women want the right to vote. We can put that question aside for later discussion. But he says, I don't know why women want the right to vote when they can make or break an entire nation by how they raise a single child. This is totally true. You can see it. The formation of a child exceeds anything that a career could actually get. Why? Because the woman's intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation of a child will affect him for the rest of his life. It's her vote, is what they used to say. It's how she impacted society. But it also sets him on the path in relationship to his eternal destiny. How you raise your child, how you actually form him is going to determine what choices, not entirely, he's got free choice, but it's going to influence tremendously the choices he makes, which will then determine his final status regarding his eternal beatitude. That, determining how far someone makes it up into heaven, or if they even make it to heaven, but if they get there and how far, where they're at in that process by the formation a woman gives, exceeds anything that a woman can do on the material level in this life. But women very often, you can have it all. In other words, you don't have to sacrifice anything. Sound familiar? And what about the crisis? So what does all this have to do with the crisis and the church? Quite frankly, I think it has to do with everything. First, we were told 70 years ago that the church needed to embrace the modern world under the aspect that we needed to evangelize the modern world. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for adapting the methods that we use, not the teachings, but the methods we use in order to convert people. I get that. Obviously, using social media today is a method, right? So obviously, we should adapt to using that in order to, but the message still remains the same. As St. Vincent of Lorraine said, always, everywhere, and for all. That's what we know, that we believe what the Catholic Church believes, is when we believe what has been taught everywhere, always,